By the time the lamp had burned low, the bench remembered the shape of a hand. A thin pool of flame clung to the glass as if unwilling to let go, and that glow outlined the bench's thumb-worn notch, the dark crescent where wood had given way to touch. Night held Florence softly, shutters drawn, bells gone distant, the piazza a flat, patient hush. Through a small high window you could see the studio inward, a room of tools, of plaster dust caught in lamplight, of smudged charcoal, and the slow geometry of stands and blocks. The city pressed itself against the glass and then retired. The studio kept breathing. Inside, the artist sat near the lamp, shoulders folded into the plain coat, hands folded as if against a slight cold. He was a steady presence, made from habits as much as from bone. The way he kept his chin a little low when reading a sketch, the particular curl of his index finger when he steadied a brush, the habit of tapping the bench 3 times with a knuckle before beginning. His breath came low and regular. Around him were the instruments of the life he had led for years, brushes laid out by size, a rasp with its teeth blunted by touch, blocks of gesso that smelled faintly of lime, a bowl dark with oil. Each object wore a small geography of his hands, the darkened ferrule of a brush where oil had gathered, a thumb polish in the limestone of a chisel handle, faint loops of charcoal where an arm had rested. The studio itself kept its ledger in these markings. There had been, once, another body in the room in constant relation to those markings, the apprentice who learned to read the studio as if reading a map. He had been present in small ways, warming his hands at the lamp, bringing water from the well, stepping back with the deference of someone who knows the master's breath as a clock. He learnt to hold a tool by the echo the tool made on the work. The apprentice's hands learned the precise pressure that would not shatter a thin panel, the tilt of wrist that opened a line in clay rather than a gouge. Repetition wrote the lessons into muscle. The apprentice understood how the master read the day in the tilt of the light across a block. The master read the apprentice in the way the younger man set down a brush, or failed to. They lived by rituals that were almost silent. Food came in the early dusk. Bread, a piece of cheese, whatever herbs were left on a neighbor's ledge. A small whistle, a sound the master used when he wished to summon the apprentice from the lane. It was not the sort of whistle that startled. It was soft and precise, more a signal to return than an order. In the evenings they would stand by the lamp and finish a stroke together, sometimes without speaking, hands knowing the same measures. The bench bore these evenings, a dark half-moon where elbows had rested, a shallow groove where a thumb had ridden the same seam for years. Time in this studio was not counted in years, but in the way a rasp left the same fine dust on the floorboards, in the way a particular rag always came back already stained, in the way a folded stool retained the hollow of the apprentice's hip. Then, as often occurs in small lives, absence arrived without fanfare. It was not a rupture declared on a public square, but a series of small departures, a commission requiring travel, a notice that an apprenticeship required a new place of learning. The apprentice's hands called to a different master for a season. The stool at the corner ceased to give the outline of a body. The oil bowl was stirred less often. The whistle went unanswered. The studio contracted. The places that had known 2 bodies now only knew 1. The lamp seemed for a time to guard an extra silence. Pages of a sketchbook remained open where a second hand would have smudged the edges. Spoons were left unwashed as if expecting some returning step. Absence was kept, materially, by small things. The apprentice's cup sat on its hook. a ring of dark on its rim where lips had touched. The rope that tied the bundle of rags still sagged in the same loop. The bench remembered not only the shape of a hand, but the cadence of its approach. A footfall at the threshold, the soft drag of a cloak on stone. Those memories were not narratives told around a table. They were pressings of habit, muscle maps, wear on tools, marks on wood. To enter the studio without that other body was to read the archive of a life with one column missing. The artist kept to his rituals. He did not fill the empty stool with another man immediately. He continued to tap the bench thrice before starting. He continued to smooth a line of gesso with a rag held in the same way. He maintained the ledger of small acts, oiling brushes in the same pattern, turning the lamp to the same angle, laying new charcoal in the same drawer. There is a particular steadfastness in craft that asks for continuance even in the face of loss. The fire in the lamp would be tended whether or not two pairs of hands warmed themselves beside it. Word moved through the quarter, as it does with people intent on their business. Neighbors noticed an empty step. Other workshops spoke in quiet voices about an apprentice who had left to learn elsewhere. There was no spectacle to it. Rumors skimmed like a sparrow across the roofs. Some patrons came less often. Yet, from the city's edge to the narrow lane, there remained a sense that the studio kept its own weather, its own ledger of presence and absence. Years of repetition had produced an archive that was not written on paper, but in bodies and objects. The bench had become a map of gestures. A brush, held and held again, had its ferrule worn in a crescent that would match a particular finger. The rasp's teeth remembered a hand that pressed with a certain steadiness. A panel that had been leaned against the wall retained the exact curve of a shoulder. The artist, in his private hours, moved through this room like a man reading notes left by a friend. He would trace a thumbprint on freshly dried gesso as if following a sentence, and the gesture would bring back the sound of a laugh, the way a youth once held a cup, the time they corrected a line together until both of them were satisfied. Recognition lives in this repetition. It does not need loud speech. It grows like a mold along a groove. When an apprentice returns to a room of two-handed routines, the proof of belonging is in the way they take up the tools. The narrative of reunion in such lives is small and true. A breath matched, a wrist falling into the same angle, fingers finding an old scar and resting there as if to confirm a geography. One late night, when the city had quieted to that deep blue hour and the lamp had gone to a low glow, the sound at the door was different. It was not a carriage or the heavy step of a patron. It was a footfall that knew how to tread a studio's floor without asking. The artist, who was finishing a small panel by lamplight, felt the change in air before he saw the shape. A draft from the threshold, and the soft scrape of a cloak. There was a pause, an intake of breath in the room that registered like a held note. The bench registered it too. The old groove in its wood seemed to remember more than memory, a readiness. The apprentice stood in the doorway for a long moment, not stepping forward at once. He tested the room in small ways. His fingers hovered over the bowl of oil, then withdrew. He placed his palm against the plastered wall and left a faint mark from travel dust. He did not announce himself with words. He had, in the years away, acquired a body that carried new lines, a pale callus where a different master's chisel had rubbed, a thin white scar across the knuckle. Yet under these differences there was a continuity. The way his hand flexed, the tilt of his head when he examined a brush. The artist saw all this as if reading a map that had been folded and unfolded. Recognition came as a series of tiny motions. The apprentice took up a chisel with a hand that slid into the handle as if it fit by long intention. The artist's breath changed. He set the panel aside and observed without moving. Then, in a movement hardly bigger than a blink, the artist reached out and tapped the bench 3 times with his knuckle. It was the same call that had summoned the apprentice so many evenings ago, a private cadence that belonged to their work. The apprentice responded not with speech, but by echoing that habit. He set his palm flat on the bench, placed the heel of his hand into the worn thumb notch, and closed his fingers as if committing the shape to memory once more. They did not embrace. The room was not the place for theatrical resolution. It was a place of measure and consent. Instead, there were familiar negotiations of space. A hand finding the rim of the oil bowl to steady itself. Fingers running along the ferrule of a brush to check that it still held. The apprentice reached out, almost as a test, and set his hand on the master's forearm. The touch was quick, a confirmation rather than a claim. The master did not recoil. His hand folded over the younger one for a moment, as if to confirm the presence. That moment held. In it was all the years of practice and absence compacted into a single, undeniable fact. 2 bodies knew how to be together in this room. Recognition deepened not in a word, but in a repetition taken up again. The apprentice lifted a brush and, without instruction, set it to the small panel as the artist had taught him. He laid the stroke with the same pressure, the same slight upward twist that had been practiced in countless evenings. The line held. The master watched with a face that made no sound, and yet was full. The way the younger man arranged his cloak speaks less than the way his thumb found the notch in the bench and rested there while he worked. The studio, which had stored the absence, now opened to a private kind of easing. Other hands in the workshop, if there were any that night, stepped back quietly. The ethical economy of such a place is careful. Closeness earned by labor, not enforced by drama. The neighbors, perhaps the keeper who had the keys when the doors were locked, perhaps a junior who had remained, allowed space. They adjusted the lamp to give better light, yet their movements were small and practical. Practical tenderness followed the recognition. The artist checked the apprentice's tools as if he were a steward ensuring the instruments were not only ready but safe. He turned the lamp to a steadier flame, wiped an old smear of plaster from a cheek of clay, smoothed a rag that the younger man used. These were acts of care that were not sentimental. They were the language of the workshop. They worked in small intervals, taking up what had been left and setting it down again. The apprentice opened a sketchbook and ran a thumb across the crease where the pages had once been torn. He laid out his own studies beside the master's, and accepted, with the same humility that marks all practice, the corrections offered. A slight shift of a line here, a suggestion of shadow there. The master's fingers guided the younger hand a fraction, and then withdrew, allowing the practice to remain the apprentice's. This restraint was as important as any instruction. It was how trust was remade. There is tenderness in tasks like these because they are ordinary. The master tightened a screw on a clamp for the apprentice. The apprentice heated a small iron to bend a metal clasp. They lit no speeches. Their language was the rasp on the block, the murmur of breath, the soft click of tools returning to their brackets. Outside, in the dim lanes of Florence, someone might have said that a boy had come home. But in the studio, the moment was kept in the register of craft. The apprentice's fidelity to a stroke, the steadying of hands, the mutual adherence to hours and measures. After the late hour's work, they paused and assessed what was to be resumed tomorrow. The lamp was carefully trimmed, a wick cut to the exact angle that the master preferred. Brushes were washed and laid with bristles facing the same way. Sketches were wrapped and set on the high shelf. The apprentice's cloak was hung in the corner where the same fold had once sat, and the old stool received the patient imprint of a body. The artist tapped the bench 3 times and nodded once, a small benediction that conferred continuance rather than possession. When the studio finally closed its small day, the artist stood for a moment by the window. He looked out at the quiet piazza, at the longer shadows that the lamp's glow threw against the lane. The city slept with a patient eye. Inside, the room had resumed its function as a keeper, of tools, of dust, of the marks that people leave upon one another. The apprentice moved to the threshold and, before going out, placed his hand flat on the bench. He did not say more than was necessary. His palm rested in the familiar notch, fitting as if completing a sentence. There was, in that gesture, a recognition that was both humble and profound. Craft makes a language that allows people to find each other again. The moral of such nights lies in accumulation. There is no dramatic proclamation, no sudden insight that rewrites lives. Instead, recognition and reunion grow from a long composing of small acts, the repeated angle of a lamp, the nightly smoothing of gesso, the steadying tap of knuckle on wood. These are not ostentatious things. They do not make for grand stories in the piazza, but they accumulate a history that is palpable. They trace a muscle memory of care that can be read by a hand when first it returns to a place. The studio is both archive and organism. It keeps records in the calloused edges of tools and responds to the arrival of a hand with a bespoke remembering. It shows that fidelity is not a force one claims, but a practice one keeps. The city beyond will advance and retreat in its own seasons. Patrons will come and go, apprentices will leave and return or leave again. And yet the steady attention paid to small acts will be what repairs and sustains the human bonds of the workshop. The lamp went lower. The bench's thumb notch caught a last glitter of light and was soon dim. The apprentice's silhouette passed into the lane, then receded under the sleeping houses. The master stood a little while longer, feeling the faint warmth where a palm had rested, listening to the studio settle. Florence breathed around the little room, and the studio, faithful as ever, held its memory like a slow ledger, an accumulation of hands, gestures, and the patient architecture of return. If you enjoy quiet studio portraits like this, like and subscribe for more stories like this. They left the door lightly ajar as if to invite the next return. Tomorrow would demand the same small attentions, trimming the lamp, checking the rasp, setting the bench right. Such tasks are the way people bind themselves to one another. The apprentice had come back, not by a single grand act, but by learning again the language of the place. And that language will continue to speak in the sound of rasp and thumb, and the exact pressure of a brush on panel. When the night finally settled, there remained the knowledge that craft is a slow conversation between bodies and things. It is in the repetition, the measured whistle, the 3 taps on the bench, the way a hand lies across a chisel, that recognition is born and reborn. The studio, in its manner, keeps each of these pieces. It keeps the memory of absence and the careful work of reunion as a lesson not preached but shown. Steady, ordinary acts are the foundations of trust. If this quiet night moved you, Share it with someone who loves the craft. Subscribe for more studio stories.